Oh hell internet, this video will be a little ranty and perhaps a little off the cuff. It will also use some strong language very strongly at certain points, but not excessively, please be assured. I will start with the situation as I see it and then go on to some theory, but of course all of this will just be my opinion as it always is. And of course it will all focus quite a lot on the United States, for reasons which I would hope are fairly obvious at this point. And I hope it will be clear throughout this video, but I am not actually here just to crap on people on the other side of the political spectrum. I am clearly on the left, and I've given reasons for that throughout my channel's videos. And even though I said this video was going to be a little bit ranty, and I might come off as emotionally elevated, even a little bit confrontational, that is mostly just for show. And it doesn't mean that when the rubber hits the road, I'm not going to sit down and agree that everyone needs to make at least some concessions. Although I will be honest, I believe it is the right that needs to make more concessions for the reasons I will give throughout this video, and I hope you can engage with those reasons in good faith. So I've been simmering since November on the state of the show, and this series is some of my oldest still public content. Maybe I'll even unprivate the original video, although that would mean watching it first, and I'm not quite sure I'm ready for that yet. Anyway, the point is that George Carlin once said in an interview that I gave up on my species and I'm just here to watch the show. This is a sentiment which deeply appalls me, and it is indicative of the fatalistic mindset which favours the unscrupulous that I've talked about in the past. That said, I am obviously no paragon as I struggle against this mindset myself, and I'm not accusing George Carlin of pernicious apathy either. If anything, his work represents the most that a single individual is capable of doing to raise awareness of the crises of modernity that we now face. But here we are then, I guess. The so-named Chinese curse is "May you live in interesting times," indicating that times of great uncertainty are also times of great worry. In fact, there is no evidence for such a curse in ancient China, and the nearest thing that's been found is a proverb to the effect of "better to be a farmer in peacetime than a prince in wartime." Regardless, there can be no doubt for anyone who is even vaguely aware of geopolitics that we do currently live in interesting times, and they are indeed worrying. And just to make a side note, anyone who actually revels in times like these is either unstable themselves or they are outright looking to disproportionately benefit from the chaos. Neither of these cases is to be trusted. But of course, we can all see that there is literally one human who is responsible for all this uncertainty, a fact which I suppose would please him greatly, and that's just part of the problem. But would you believe I was disappointed with the result of the US election last year? I know, it's astonishing, eh? That isn't to say that I don't understand some of why it happened, and I knew it was close, and it was close, don't let anyone tell you different. But fair's fair, Trump got a slim victory in both the popular vote and in the swing states, and he got that victory entirely by motivating demographics, and of course a bit of good old-fashioned voter suppression, but then that's just the Republicans, eh? If the Dems haven't been able to figure out a solution for that problem yet, then they deserve the loss, quite frankly. By the way, I just want to say, if you are the sort of person who appreciates owning the libs or triggering the snowflakes, then I have this to say. You are a snowflake, and you are triggered. That's what it means when people who are not psychotic act with the intent to make others feel worse. I'm not even saying that you don't have valid points to make, but your political hatred has compromised your judgment if all you want to do is inflict pain. And the same goes to all those lefties who like to declare that all Trumpers are just terrible people. Clearly, that is not true, any more than it is true that all Kamala voters are wonderful people. I'll be honest, I was perhaps over-invested in the election result. Actually, no, scratch that. I was appropriately invested in the result, but it did consume too much of my attention in the lead-up. At the end, I was cautiously optimistic that Kamala Harris would siphon enough support from the centre, and in this, I was largely influenced by never-Trump Republicans like those at the Bulwark. And they were dead fucking wrong. Either there was not enough support to be siphoned from the centre, or there were just too many people who wanted more change. The more left-wing outlets were screaming blue murder that she was being too centrist and promising nothing meaningful. And there is clearly something to this. Harris's energy was highest before the Biden staffers corporatized her message. The fact is that chaining, or should that be chainying, herself to Biden was a mistake, regardless of Biden's actual record, because he was supposed to be, as he said himself, a transition president. The word transition implies a change from something to something else. Something, fresh and new and vital and different. And so Trump was able to make himself the change candidate once again. And he was! It turns out that Trump was the real radical in all this. Who would have thunk it? The 2024 election was just an ideological rerun of 2016, and neoliberalism lost both times. Personally, for whatever my opinion is worth, I liked Kamala Harris as a candidate, and I think she would have made a good president. And still could, I suppose, but probably won't. She could have won, I think, if she had run significantly to Biden's left, where she was branded as being anyway. And let's be absolutely fucking clear here. Biden was right of centre his entire career by any balanced metric of political leaning. His administration was, I admit, less conservative than I was expecting, but that is a very low bar in the US. And if you want to try and claim in comments that Biden was some kind of radical leftist, then you can expect me to laugh in your fucking face, because it is you who obviously does not understand what words mean. Ultimately, Kamala Harris was the status quo candidate, and she lost for it. And I have to clarify, yes, I am aware that Biden's economy, contrary to Fox propaganda, was okay, and honestly better than many post-COVID economies around the world. But again, his role as a transition president was explicitly to be the last incumbent in this particular status quo. And quite aside from being Genocide Joe, which we'll come to in a minute, he reneged on that promise as well, and showed that neoliberalism would never change. And on the topic of that nickname, yes, of course Gaza made a difference. And no, of course it doesn't matter that Trump was always going to be worse. We already know that the average US voter is undereducated generally and disengaged from geopolitics in specific. If Trump is cucked to Putin, then Biden was cucked to Netanyahu. And so is Trump, now that we see. And just to go a little bit further, yes, wars do still regrettably happen, and the term collateral damage tragically exists for a reason. But if you are in a war, and the number of civilians you have killed is more than one full order of magnitude higher than the number your opponent has killed, then you have lost the moral high ground, period. And if the number of civilians you have killed is of an order of magnitude that is closer to the total population than it is to zero, then there is a case for genocide, period. Post-election then, I said to a friend, it's obviously going to be pretty bad, but they are so incompetent I hope at least it will be funny. For the first month it was just bad, but now the incompetence seems to be kicking in. Don't get me wrong, my heart still goes out to all those people who will be hurt by this, yes, even those who voted for Trump, which is a conversation I'm not getting into today. But then, what do I know? I am no more a geopolitics expert than I am a philosophy expert. But do I need to be? Isn't it blatantly obvious that Trump is a political toddler? His tariffs have been economic insanity for the US. He clearly cannot explain the strategy of Doge, nor the mechanism of how it makes America great again. Waste, fraud, and abuse explains nothing, just like I will create the most beautiful economy explains nothing. But all he ever does is say it's going to be great and let you assume that he means what you think he means. In fact, it is just a pitiful cover for "we just hate government." And just to address the idea that this is necessary chaos to restore economic order post-Biden, that is equally preposterous. The whole point about economic stability is that you don't change anything too fast. And yes, I say that to the left as well. The fact is, he has made it so bad for so many people that that proves he isn't concerned about the American worker. Looking at the global picture, aside from the monstrosity that could be the Gaza Plaza, Trump has decided to be a complete asshole to all of the US former allies. Spare me the BS. The US was not getting ripped off wholesale. It was buying something for its military protection. It was buying its de facto place as a leader in the global community, and it was showing its good faith to contribute in that spirit. I have heard some say that the US largesse has helped the Europeans to build their socialist societies, which does have a veneer of truth to it. Europe's increased defense spending is, believe it or not, something I think Trump was right to expect. But the US had previously wanted to have the responsibility of global security because it made lots of money doing it. And Europe certainly did not ask the US to starve their public services for profit. You did that to yourselves. And let's come back to Trump. Look at the man. He's a rambling old grandpa, constantly talking in superlatives. I'm the best and they're the worst, okay? He's not playing hardball to cut a deal. He's just being the same old self-aggrandizing cunt he has been his whole life, ever since he was a New York liberal hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Clinton. I've even heard it said that he's actually a Russian asset in the amount of chaos he has caused. To be clear, I don't think there's any evidence of this, but you tell me, if Donald Trump had met Putin in the 90s and Vlad had said, "I can make you king of America one day," what do you think he says? That said, I don't think even Vladimir Putin is completely safe from Trump's irascible temper and willful ignorance on anything that isn't going to be of specific benefit to him. Not the US, him, Donald J. Trump. Incidentally, I made a video a few years back called "I am proud of my Trump derangement syndrome, but I don't hate him." And I still am, and I still don't. Rather, I pity Donald J. Trump because he is such a ridiculous man and such a weak man. Now that might seem ridiculous in itself to say, considering how much power he has, but weak men have been given power repeatedly throughout history, and the mark of a weak man is that they try to be strong by acting recklessly. And that's Donald J. Trump all over, and it clearly does not bring him happiness. So what's the result of all this? Well, the result is that Trump has destroyed the American world order in about 6 weeks. USA! USA! Failing some unfavourable crisis, China and India are going to eat your lunch in the next 10 to 20 years, and I think the dragon will eventually bring the reckless bear to heel. Eventually, when it suits them. This isn't to say that I'm especially excited for this situation, and I do hope that the US can restabilise, but regardless, this period will not be forgotten. Where the balance of power falls will determine the new world order and the fate of democracy for the next few decades at least. So, is it time for a socialist revolution against oligarchy? No. In spite of everything, I am still a never revolutionary, so to speak. There should never be an armed uprising if it can possibly be avoided. For some, this marks me as a spineless incrementalist, barely better than a neoliberal. Class consciousness cannot emerge slowly, they cry. And I do see their point. Maybe they are right about me. In the next few minutes, I will talk quite derisively about technocrats and oligarchs. However, you will see that my rhetoric implicitly allows for their existence. In this respect, I think I do agree with Hobbes, to a point. The chances of any popular uprising installing a government that really stands for the people is unfortunately remote. When the obsession with power leads to violence, then again it is the most ruthless who are the most advantaged, as the Trump administration adequately demonstrates. But if a boneheaded technocratic class become convinced that their ivory towers are the reason for their right to lead, and so lose sight of the purpose of their leadership, then there does come a point where, regardless of the outcome, even I say that they fucking brought it on themselves, the fucking idiots. Let's do a little armchair psychology, shall we? The neoliberal technocrats and tech-bro oligarchs that they have enabled tend to be sympathetic to a somewhat Nietzschean worldview which rejects the morality of empathy. The man, or I suppose technically the woman, who can act to enforce their will is just self-overcoming, and it's an unfortunate coincidence that this self-overcoming may happen to involve the incidental overcoming of other people too. Nothing morally complicated there. This is why dyed-in-the-wool neoliberals are seen as barely different from conservatives, because once you have the power, then it doesn't matter how you got it, you are justified in how you use it. Nietzsche wasn't exactly shy in his rhetoric here either, even if he did, in principle, want self-overcoming to be universal, although it is unclear in practice what the hell this might look like. The genealogy of morals looks back to the pre-Christian morality, based in ideas like the Greek aristouin, the striving to be the best of all, from which we get the word aristocracy, the rule of the best. And they, the self-appointed aristocrats, thereby judge that this self-overcoming equates with moral goodness, and that this description fits their pattern of behaviours, irrespective of what the world might look like afterwards. Here's another little bit of etymology for you. The word lord comes from the term loaf ward, being the person who is in charge of distributing rations. The term ward does connote a certain amount of authority, but what it does not imply is the right to withhold those rations entirely, because in that case they are no longer your ward and the bond of trust has been broken. In other words, if you fancy yourself part of the global aristocracy in the age of nation-states and no common wilderness, then universal basic income is morally obligatory, because if you, as the loaf ward, are not supplying loaves to your wards, then they don't owe you shit. And just to clarify, even though I use the term morally obligatory, it is slightly tongue-in-cheek because I'm a moral anti-realist and I think that all morality is designed by humans within the human world. Now, All of my essays on Hannah Arendt and her position that the world exists only in the plurality of humans means that I do insist that, yes, if you do have a part to play in the human world, then it should consider all humans as having equal moral value, and that's where my morality comes from. On the other hand, I will admit that it will be perfectly possible for somebody who has a different perspective to me to come up with a probably quite coherent moral case against what I have just said. The technocrats and oligarchs have lost sight of any kind of balance here. They have become pathologically attached to the functional values of power and money, and the neoliberal establishment's refusal to acknowledge this has led us here, to change by any means necessary, even taking a gamble on a right-wing demagogue who turns out to be as bad or worse. It does not help that people tend to fall into fatalism, which is to the benefit of the unscrupulous. It does not help that the 20th century traumas have blinkered the worldview of many of the people still clinging grimly to power to this day, out of fear. And yes, it does not help, of course, that fear, anger, and disgust continue to be motivating factors in many people's moral behaviour, and only education can counter these biases, assuming one accepts, of course, that these biases are not morally neutral. And there's the rub, isn't it? Everyone agrees that there are things which are not morally neutral, but large groups of people disagree on what these things are, which is why education itself has become a political battleground. And the answer, which is so blindingly obvious and yet still so unpalatable, especially to conservatives in fairness, is that there is no objective answer. There isn't. All of life's meaning, all of it, is within the human world and is the result of human fabrications. These fabrications are many and varied, from technological advancements to ethical structures to cultural achievements. And it takes great skill to be able to weave with these different threads to produce the fabric of history. Many patterns are possible, and the pattern is constantly changing as it is continually dispensed by the loom of the present from the infinite spools of contingent possibility. I don't claim to understand the principles upon which the pattern of the modern world is woven, but if the concept of universal human dignity and the greatest happiness for the greatest number is even up there on the list, then it is quite clear why neoliberalism is failing, because trickle-down economics is just pissing on our heads and telling us it's raining. And by this point, I'm sure that some viewers will be throwing up their hands to accuse me of supporting some kind of socialist utopia before launching into a condemnatory screed about how I don't understand the implications of my bleeding heart policies, and if you aren't a conservative when you're older, then you have no brain, and other worn-out, condescending straw man nonsense. First, as many people have said many times, the wave of socialist and communist regimes of the 20th century followed directly from centuries of monarchic and oligarchic rule. The political actors who instigated these new regimes fell victim to the same curse of power, the cult of personality. Stalin was a dictator. He may have come to power on the back of a left-wing ideology, but all that shows is that left-wing politics is also susceptible to being co-opted by megalomaniacal fuckheads. Horseshoe theory is real, hardly news to me. Second, as we saw in tradition in the modern age, it is known that Marxist political philosophy suffered from the monotheistically exceptional idea that material history could be completed and thus perfected. Another holdover from the monarchic age which has been investigated and completely debunked in the nearly 100 years of leftist political thought that have happened since the socialist experiments of the mid-20th century. And third, in the modern age, countries and communities the world over have demonstrated the power of socialised benefits, and yes, even some measure of central planning, within certain specific boundaries, like healthcare, for example. Serious leftists today want to keep markets and private commerce. They acknowledge the potency of the profit incentive for building economic growth and innovation. They just oppose the concentration of power that unfettered free markets always lead to. But even then, I'm not saying that any kind of system is the one true answer, and this is the result of process becoming the source of meaning. Utopias don't exist, they never will, and they never have. And can we just acknowledge that the popular right is equally committed to the utopian dream of a perfect society that happened in the past, which is even easier to debunk than Marxist utopias? We need to be able to have nuanced conversations about this, and that's the problem. What is being lost in the current brand of politics on both left and right is any kind of nuance. George W. Bush famously said that he doesn't do nuance, and although he was not the first person to act this way, he was perhaps the first to be so obnoxiously proud of the fact, and the embrace of this mindset has led directly to Trump, and I hope George Bush knows that. But Is there even another way anymore? Post-truth politics is about narratives, and narratives are best when they are simple. Indeed, that is the very purpose of narrative, to take a complicated and messy set of events and weave them into a simple and ordered story for our minds to be able to work with. Even our biology is against us. I can whine as much as I like about the destructive influence of fear, anger, and mistrust, but I can't change the fact that the regions of our primitive brain that deal with instantaneous interests and aversions for survival have been apparently hijacked by our moral sense in society. In other words, we tend to believe without justification that if we feel disgusted by something, then that gives validity to our moral condemnation. And now some on the left will be angry with me for even referencing the idea that Evo psychology might be a thing, because it impinges on their narratives about social freedoms. More death of nuance. But of course, there is a nuanced conversation to be had there too. Another time. I want to give something concrete though. One thing that I think might lead towards a solution is the total rejection of NIMBY. NIMBY, or not in my backyard, is the impulse to oppose not social change itself, but any suggestion that you personally have to bear the mental labour of that change. To be NIMBY is very understandable, natural, even forgivable, but in the modern world, unhelpful. The world is full of different people, and you know, yes you do, that the vast majority of them are decent people, or at least decent enough that you don't have to live in fear of them all the time. And that sentence is true across all possible different groups. The overwhelming majority of humans are just trying to live a life in a world that they only barely understand. They are not forming some grand conspiracy against you, and if you think they are, then the reverse is far more likely to be true. The answer then cannot be NIMBY, but must be YIMBY, and YEBY, and YOBY. And this is going to apply to the social policies of both the left and the right. Although I won't hide my opinion, I believe that the Overton window has been dragged so far to the right in the last 100 years that it will continue to be the right that need to make the most obvious concessions upon the face of it. But, my Dexter friends, your life will barely change in the grand scheme of things, so you don't need to stress over it, really. Finally, and speaking of biases, what are mine? This will actually be the basis of a second and much more fun video, I hope. But suffice to say, I'm not entirely in a left-wing echo chamber, although I do have my limits. I won't listen to Fox News or anything that's like it, because their MO is just lying, and this is well documented. I'm not saying they never make any good points, but Fox, for example, has settled a $1 billion defamation lawsuit. And then, of course, there is their immortal Tucker Carlson defense. You can't hold me responsible for my sensationalist lies. Everyone knows I'm only an entertainment program. Incredible. In the independent space too, many people are at least influenced, if not entirely corrupted by the profit motive. And of course, everyone screams blue murder that it's everyone else that is a sellout and a grifter. Well, you can see what I think in the next video, but there I think I will leave the state of the show for now. Expect the next update before 2030. Maybe. Bye for now.